Hi, I'm Katie Miranda, and today I am here with Rabbi Alissa Wise, Deputy Director of Jewish Voice for Peace and co-founder of JVP's Rabbinical Council. She is a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Welcome, Rabbi Wise.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us how you got involved with JVP?
Sure. My trajectory to JVP was a little bit um, lengthy. So I was actually raised in a home that was very Zionist, even right wing so, and I was raised to be a defender of Israel, and believed that in my heart until I went to college in the late 90s, at which point I spent some time in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, where there were protests about an occupation that I had never heard of, even though I had been to the region multiple times with my family on Jewish communal missions to Israel. So that was a really eye-opening experience and kind of changed the trajectory of my life. And so after that time, I kind of reoriented my life, but still kind of rooted in a very strong Jewish identity and a very strong commitment to what happens with the Jewish people and that the Jewish people should be a force for good in the world, and is what I believed what was true. And when I understood the realities of Israeli domination over Palestinians, it kind of shook me to my core. And so I became a rabbi in pursuit of being able to be a really powerful and spiritually rooted leader in the Jewish community in pursuit of Palestinian human rights. And so once I was done with rabbinical school, JV, and it happened to match when Jewish Voice for Peace decided to shift from being just a Bay Area organization to become a national organization. And with that decision, JVP was essentially deciding to fight to win, right? That we were really going to try to grow a mass movement of American Jews for Palestinian rights, unlike there's ever been. And I was very privileged to be able to join JVP at that early phase. So I've seen JVP grow tremendously in the years that I've been here. When I started, I was the sixth employee, and now we have over 30.
Wow.
There were 7 chapters, and we now have over 70 chapters, right? So our membership has gone from a few hundred to nearly 16,000. With over 250,000 supporters, right? So our growth has just been incredible in the time that I've been here, and I've been very blessed and feel very fortunate that, I'm able to dedicate my life to this work that I believe in so strongly, and also see it be as successful as it is.
So you were mentioning how much growth JVP has had over the past how many years have you guys been around?
Well, we began in the late 90s just as a Bay Area group, and really started off around the second Intifada, but became a national organization in the like around 2006, 2007.
So what outreach strategies have you used to the American Jewish community to raise this awareness and support for Palestinian rights? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, do you want to talk about Jewish community transformation?
Well, you know, one of the things that I think is really important to say about JVP's growth, and is related to kind of how JVP does our work in general, is that have to hold some really powerful and strong contradictions in our work. So by contradictions, I don't mean saying one thing and doing another. I mean, there's a dynamic tension in the work that we do. So in what I'm talking about is that you can map JVP's growth on a graph where you'll see that each moment of kind of more profound growth mirrors Israeli assaults in
Oh,
the Gaza
wow.
there. And so one thing that we're really mindful of is that as Israeli aggression especially on the people of Gaza, though you can also map it to the war in Lebanon and other moments over the past decade, that that is a sobering reality, right? And actually right now we're challenging ourselves to figure out outreach strategies to be able to grow without having to rely on Israeli aggression and violence and deaths of thousands in Gaza and other places. So we're just so that's the kind of contradiction, we have multiple of those contradictions. I mean, inside JVP, there's also the contradiction that our existence as a thriving Jewish organization where so many American Jews are finding a political home for the first time is because of Palestinian suffering, right? So these are the kinds of ethical, spiritual, and political contradictions that are very deeply inherent in our work. And so it's not to say, though, at the same time that we don't have a sophisticated organizing program to bring these people in, because we do, right? So we are modeled on a grassroots organizing model, which means we believe from local communities, campus, to all the way to Congress, that the change that we want to see, which is a change in U.S. foreign policy against Israeli apartheid and for Palestinian rights, will not come from the people at the top, but will come from the grassroots. So our model is the model about building a mass movement of grassroots power that we then can use to change not just local, but also Jewish communal institutions and all the way up to Congress, right? And so over the years that I've been with JVP and we've been experiencing this growth in our numbers, it also does match to incremental wins within the Palestine solidarity community. So when I started from around 2010, we had an action at the Jewish Federation General Assembly, where Netanyahu was speaking, and a bunch of young Jews in a rolling way kind of stood up and unfurled a banner saying that Israel does not represent them, in a huge disruption. And that was, a very intense moment within the Jewish community. It was really like a coming out moment for JVP and the young Jews inside of JVP. And there was a very strong visceral reaction. By the end of the rolling disruptions, one of the people in the audience ripped the banner from somebody's hands with his teeth and was doing it, right? So it's you can't state just how shocking it was to people, right? That he would just an animal reaction to it. And from then, just a few years later, in 2014, JVP for a decade had been supporting our partners in the Presbyterian Church in their efforts to align their values with their investments. And 4 years later, one of the largest mainline Protestant groups votes to support divesting from companies profiting from the Israeli occupation. And then 3 years after that, in 2017, Representative Betty McCollum introduces the first legislation for Palestinian rights into Congress, right? So over this time, we're also be able to map that there's actually very significant influence that we're having in increasing spaces of power and influence, right? And all of those are examples of things that grassroots organizing has made possible, right? So our model is about building power on the local level, on the campus level, and then bringing that power to bear when we go to the media or to DC or even to our local communities.
Do you want to talk about how JVP approaches Jewish community transformation?
Sure. So we've changed over the years, right? So since that story of the Jewish Federation and the disruptions of Netanyahu, right, that would be more of an example of banging at the door for inclusion in the American Jewish community. And since that time, our strategy has really evolved to not banging for inclusion, but instead realizing that we are actually creating an alternative Jewish community and alternative Jewish institutions outside of the mainstream, right? So some examples of that include that over the past year, organically, right? Not by our doing, but just popping up throughout our chapters are non-Zionist spiritual communities, like congregations or Chavurot, as they're called, which are kind of like lay-led, home-based spiritual communities are popping up. And we have over 30 of them now that exist throughout the United States. And some of them are more established synagogues, and some are, they meet in somebody's living room once a month. But there's this trend of people just really thirsty, and I think the Trump administration is to thank for this, we're thirsty for spiritual sustenance and connection, right? Mm-hmm. So they're building these non-Zionist spiritual communities. And from the beginning, JBP has been inspired by and motivated by Jewish traditions in order to inspire our work. So what that has meant is that, liberation Passover Seders and alternative celebrations of Hanukkah and the high holidays have always been part of how our chapters have built community. But I think what we're seeing now is that over the years that JVP has been working, we no longer are, asking for permission, right? And instead we're just claiming our space. And I think that's been a very exciting transition for me to be part of and witness, because I think part of our goal as an organization is to change American Jewish public opinion on this issue, right? That's our unique role in the movement, right? Like, we are part of a multifaceted movement for Palestinian rights, right? And there's different organizations that organize different constituencies. And for us at JVP, we have a unique and important role in bringing more American Jews into this movement. And we do that in many ways, right? It's like organizing on the local level, but there's also like a discourse shift. And we've seen it now that it's impossible for anybody to say the Jewish community in America thinks X about Israel. Right? No, like when we started this work, people were able to do that without challenge, right? Like mainstream pro-Israel organizations were able to say, Jews think, as on behalf of American Jews, that we say we support Israel, right? That's impossible now, right? And we've seen more and more Jewish organizations sprout up, the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and If Not Now, and Open Hillel, right? All of these other Jewish organizations have sprouted in these years, and we think it's wonderful to see more and more manifestations of a progressive Judaism for Palestinian rights. And so we think that all of that is really essential and key to what our role is in the movement, right? And that we continue, as we grow, to continue to push the boundaries, right? So it was just a few years ago, in 2015, that we formally endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and we're still the only Jewish organization in the U.S. to do so. And so even as we grow and have more influence and have more power and are being watched, right, essentially, we continue to push ever more the bounds of the conversation. And I think, we're going to continue to talk about, and especially as Trump is assaulting refugee rights, right? We strongly support the Palestinian right of return. Our students lead the Return the Birthright campaign that is based on a really strong and fierce commitment to Palestinian refugee rights, right? So we can see our role as continuing to push the envelope, and that as we do so, more and more people are coming to us, and more people are able to see, like, actually, this is my Judaism. There are so many stories of people who had been separated from Jewish community because they thought that they had to check their politics and their values at the door. And so it's also been a time of people returning to Jewish life and Jewish community and Jewish holidays and Jewish rhythms. And so obviously, as a rabbi, that's particularly heartening for me.
What outreach strategies to the Jewish community are not working and people should stop doing them? I mean, you guys must have had it must have been pretty trial and error, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that hasn't worked is, we had tried shortly after um, the Jewish Federation disruption in 2010, like around 2011, 2012, we created a curriculum called Go and Learn, which was about educating the Jewish community about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And this was before we even endorsed the call. But BDS was just then starting to become this buzzword and taboo word. And we had this vision of kind of going into mainstream Jewish communities and holding workshops and teach-ins. And it wasn't successful because it was successful for people who were already with us, but none of the mainstream places that we wanted to go to would work with us, right? So even once in New York, we had something booked just to use their space at the 14th Street Y in New York City. And the day before, they canceled us from being there from outside pressure. So I think we learned that there was a limit of like how we could go into mainstream spaces
I
and try
see.
to have an honest conversation within mainstream spaces. Um,
So is it
and
more about bringing people into
yeah,
you guys rather than going out and get
yeah,
kind of
it's
like
about being visible.
preaching, I
Yeah,
guess?
it's more about being visible,
Uh-huh.
being effective, winning campaigns. Like when there's moments like the Presbyterian divestment, or when there's moments like the Great Return March in Gaza or the U.S. Embassy move, or even when, there's moments of like Trump's election. We had a lot of, we have learned a lot of organizing skills that frankly a lot of Jewish institutions don't have, right? About how to build strong local multi-faith, multiracial coalitions, and how to build chapters on the local level, and how to do leadership development with our members and leaders in order for everybody to be building their skills and political analysis to be able to continue to take on more and more like roles and responsibilities in the movement. And so we had a lot to bring to the table. So I think like we learned that like it was more about like doing our work as powerfully and visibly and clearly as we can with very open arms, that like we're here if you want to join us, and continuing to make opportunities for people to join us, right? To creating lots of inroads, right? So everybody likes different things, right? And everybody has different skills to bring. And everybody, like, there's some people who would like never go to a street protest in their life. And then there's people who would never go meet with a congressperson in their life, right? And then there's
Uh-huh.
people who like need to have ritual, and people who are scared of ritual, and people, and so part of what we've learned is that we need to have multiple entry points, right? There can't just be one cookie cutter way to participate in the movement, right? So you make opportunities for academics to be academics in the movement, right? That they don't have to take off their analytical and research and education hats, but in
Right.
fact, be an asset, right?
Hmm.
Same with cultural workers and artists, right? That they should be able to be artists in the movement and allow the work to be more creative and generative and imaginative. Um, and for people to organize in their own space. So students building strong campaigns and partnerships on their campuses, and also for rabbis to have a voice to be able to, and support from a community of like-minded rabbis to take hard positions within the Jewish community. And so I think that's been a really important piece. And I think when we go to um, trying to have like a one size fits all model of activism is when we have run into problems, right? I think that has been our least successful. But instead, when we're like, if you want to make phone calls, come make phone calls. If you are scared of the phone and only want to, like write something, like we will help you place your op-ed, right? And if, you know, you don't have facilitation skills, we'll train you in how to facilitate meetings, right? If like you are really excited about congressional work, we'll give you the skills and tools you need in order to have effective conversations with your local elected officials, right? And so it's about that balance of like meeting people where they are, but also supporting and pushing people to build their skills. And we see this as transferable, right? That like, God willing, one day when Palestine is free, all of our activists, our thousands of activists, have built really critical skills that they can bring and already are, frankly, bringing into other movements and other issues.
And I want to just point out something that JVP is not just for Jews, right? Because I have a friend here in Oregon. She's a Indian, originally from India, a Muslim, and she's very, very active in the JVP chapter here.
Absolutely. I mean, that is like every Jewish family in the United States, right? Every Jewish family is a multi-faith, multiracial family, and that's who we are at JVP, right? And so it is a source of our strength and our power that we have so many strong and committed allies from outside the Jewish community that are interested in doing effective strategic organizing and and are comfortable with the framework being inspired by Jewish tradition as a jumping off point to do that work.
So, what strategies are working to end U.S. support for Israeli apartheid, both in Congress and on campuses?
Yeah, so I think the main thing in Congress that we're seeing now is that JVP currently is just a C3 organization, so we don't participate in elections because we don't have the status to do that. But even without, our local chapters are building really strong alliances with members of the Progressive Caucus throughout the country. So we've seen not just Betty McCollum introduce this legislation, which was through a coalition that JVP is a part of that was led by Defense of Children, International Palestine, and American Friends Service Committee, and others, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. But we're seeing that there's also an example of a representative from Madison, Wisconsin, Mark Pocan, who went on a trip to Palestine that really opened his eyes, and JVP organized a town hall for him to be able to tell his story of what he saw there, right? And we're building relationships in the local level that is breaking the kind of hold on AIPAC. That AIPAC has had on Congress people and our elected officials, that it was too dangerous, quote unquote, for them to speak out about for Palestinian rights or against Israeli policy, because it would jeopardize their standing and their elections. And what we're showing is that there's part of being a progressive Democrat is support for Palestinian rights. That you can't say, I support Black Lives Matter and I support healthcare for all, but I have this right-wing stance on Palestine, right? Like so many connections are being built through people of color-led movements in the U.S. directly to movements in Palestine, and that it's clear that there is no turning your back on Palestine and being supported by a progressive Democratic base. And it's really changing the face of the Democratic Party and what's possible in Congress. And that's because of grassroots, like everyday people like you and me, like building relationships and voting people out and voting people in, right? Like, next week here is the midterm election where
everybody vote.
Yeah, where women of color in particular are kind of changing the face of American democracy, right? And, we'll see what happens. But I think, there's a big turn happening, and that there's, through the steady push of organizations throughout the Palestine Solidarity Movement, there's more opportunity than there's ever been. And then on campus, I think in every social movement throughout history, there's been a strong campus movement that has sparked it forward. That was definitely true, in particular around the fight to end apartheid in South Africa. And the same is true on college campuses, that when students are bringing divestment resolutions to their student councils or whatever bodies within their campuses and colleges, they're doing it with the backing and support of nearly every student group, right? Whether it's like the LGBTQ group, the immigrant rights group, the Black Lives Matter group, right? The Muslim Students Association, right? And so there's just like very broad and very inspirational, multiracial, multi-faith, multi-issue, right? And that all these student groups are seeing that, what's happening in Palestine and U.S. support for Palestine and the U.S.-Israel relationship and the Trump-Netanyahu alliance touches all our work, right? So whether it's immigration and the trading of worst practices of border control between like that we see the wall in Palestine and the wall that Trump plans to build and the strategies that Trump uses on the border and the Trump strategies that Netanyahu uses at the border. And of course, our Deadly Exchange campaign, which I hope to talk about a little bit more, which looks at the police exchange programs between the US and Israel, where police chiefs and sheriffs and ICE agents and FBI agents are brought to Israel to exchange worst practices with the Israeli military, right? So you can't separate these issues. There's no such thing as like that's happening over there, right? Because of the Trump-Netanyahu alliance, which frankly has been in, the U.S.-Israel alliance has been in place far beyond, but there's a certain, right-wing fascistic tenor to this particular version of the U.S.-Israel alliance. So I think that is really promising. And I think our chapters on the local level, everything they do is done in powerful coalition. And I think in this political moment, in the wake of the Pittsburgh massacre this past weekend, we really see how those relationships of solidarity that are being built through organizing and campaigns then are like flourishing and so nourishing and supportive in these moments of crisis.
So what strategies are not working in terms of changing U.S. policies in the Middle East and on campus?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think on the congressional level, we're not trying to be an alternative AIPAC. And we see that the strategies that kind of tend towards that, right, of trying to like be an alternative lobby group that holds sway through money and influence and power, is not the way forward, right? That's not the way that we're going to be able to build the power that we need to change U.S. policy, but instead to be able to build our numbers and create a mass movement where people who support those policies are unelectable. And I think on campuses, I think it's very challenging. We found that it's very challenging for a number of reasons, because one is there's such a vile attack on Palestinian and Muslim and Arab students that's funded to the tunes of millions of dollars by the likes of Sheldon Adelson and his ilk, who are kind of ruthless in their attack on students.
And this is like an example would be Canary Mission.
Yeah, right. I was going to say the shadowy website Canary Mission is one tool that they use, right? And so part of what is difficult around that is that it creates a chilling effect, and people are nervous about being public and visible. And it's about being public and visible about their own family stories, right? It's like, this is what happened to my grandmother in 1948. And yet that is outside the bounds of what's acceptable to talk about. And you can face repercussions, right? Like the repercussions are serious for people who have their faces and profiles on this shadowy website that's used either somebody Googles you if you're applying to a medical school or to a new job, right? And they don't know anything about that. Canary Mission isn't reputable, but they make you look terrible and scary. And or Israel uses it at the border, which we now know is true, that at the border they're using Canary Mission to refuse entry, right? And so if you have family that you want to see in Palestine, right, that it can be very serious. And so, I think one of the things that we need to do, and something that we've been like, I don't have any answers right this second. Maybe we could talk in a few months and we will have thought of something, but what are the roles for student leaders who, and even just what are the opportunities for people who don't want to be and can't be visible? Because I think we rely a lot on visibility in order for people to have powerful activist impact, right? Like you have to like put your name on the email, or put your face on, or have a strong social media presence, or like put yourself out there, right? And so for people who it's not safe to do that, I don't think we have good roles for them in the movement right now.
What
And I
about
think,
like, you know, putting stamps on letters and making phone calls
yeah, but
and
still, yes, absolutely. There are those kinds of things to do, but I also feel like those people have really powerful voices
mhm.
and experiences, and that's precisely why they're being targeted. So how do we make sure that their stories and their opinions and their passions are reflected, right? And that they can still contribute to strategizing, even if they can't be part of um,
I
implementing, or
see. Yeah.
what I'm saying. So like,
Yeah.
I just think we need to just figure out more ways for people who, in this McCarthyite fascistic environment can still, there's a catharsis, right, in being able to take action, right? Just this morning, I was in the streets denouncing white nationalism, and there's a catharsis there, right? And so, but then there's also a privilege for people to feel safe to do that kind of thing. So how do we create other cathartic moments for people to speak, to feel like they're speaking their mind and having an impact, so they don't feel silenced in the corner, that they don't get to have like a substantive impact on the work because of their identities and their desires to see their families, which are totally important and need to be preserved.
So we're just about out of time, but I know you wanted to talk about the Deadly Exchange campaign. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I just think it's an example, as you're asking about what's working.
Right.
I think we're finding that so the Deadly Exchange campaign is a campaign that JVP has launched to look at and try to disrupt these police exchange programs that where top level law enforcement go to Israel for a week for an exchange of worst practices with Israeli police and military and intelligence practices such as racial profiling, surveillance, suppression of social movements, use of force. These trips completely whitewash Israel's occupation and apartheid. And it turns it like Israel has long used its domination over Palestinians as a kind of laboratory to develop new strategies of control and weapons of control. And at the same time, we know, policing in the US is rooted in slavery, right? And the domination of Black people in this country. And the strategies that the US uses, like broken windows policing and racial profiling, like there's an exchange of practices. So we don't think like Israel's teaching the US police how to do terrible things. It's obviously they both are equally sharing these, dangerous and racist practices with each other. And so the strategies that we're using to go after these police exchange programs include the coalition work that I mentioned. That is like a hallmark of how JVP does our work. And we had our first win in Durham, North Carolina, where our chapter formed a really strong coalition, which included Black Youth Project 100, Muslims for Social Justice, Muslim American Public Affairs Council, Students for Justice in Palestine at some of the local universities. And they got the Durham City Council to not only pass a policy, but explicitly say that critiquing Israel and taking a stand against government actions is not anti-Semitic. and that they have a policy that they will not run police. They will not send their police on these exchange programs
Oh,
to
that's
Israel.
great.
That was a very hugely successful campaign in Durham, and our Washington, D.C. chapter has just launched their campaign called Occupation Free D.C., which likewise has a very strong coalition with American Muslims for Palestine and the Democratic Socialists and the Black Youth Project 100. And they're calling for the DC Police Department to prohibit training with discriminatory trainers, as they're calling it, and to invest instead in local DC communities rather than police departments. And we're hoping to see more of those campaigns. And so, fundamentally, this Deadly Exchange campaign is about ending these toxic relationships. But on the other side, it's about building the types of relationships that we need to be in place for everyone to be safe. And, one of the taglines of the campaign is safety through solidarity, which is taken on a new meaning this week for many of us in the Jewish community, but that we find that like doing co-resisting, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a lot of focus on coexisting, but there's also really important work of co-resisting, and that through building relationships through campaign work and putting relationships first, we're putting into the practice the campaign vision of the world we do want to see, which is multicultural, multiracial communities that are keeping one another safe. So I think it's an exciting model, and at the local level, having these opportunities to work on something so concrete, right, is very helpful, right? Because a lot of times it's hard to figure out, well, what do we do, right? So here's a thing to do, which is also, very exciting and clarifying for many people looking to have an impact.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rabbi Weiss.
Thank you. It was fun to talk to you.
Great.